So let's talk about these two paths though, because there's two paths essentially that folks can take in terms of developing an addiction. The first one here is being prescribed an opioid. And this is something again where when you look at the opioid deaths and the pain, like there's definitely this connection, and where you get prescribed like post-surgically, or you've got low back pain, or you have an accident or something, and then excuse me, that gets you started on opioids, and it just progresses from there. And so when you think about the moving towards an overdose, it goes there's this progression that people go through. There's the initiation phase where they're starting and they first get exposed to opioids, and then the use progresses where maybe they're not using it just for medical reasons anymore. They're using it for maybe mental health reasons anymore, or just avoiding chemical dependency, those sorts of things, or not avoiding chemical dependency, avoiding withdrawal. But their dose is increasing over time. And then eventually they make their way to overdose. Generally speaking, that's how we look at it. And so the prescription part, that was where we were saying, well, what if we don't start, then yeah, it can also be related to progression. But if we change the prescribing, right, both the initiation and then continuing to give more and more and more, then we can stop that movement into progression. We can stop that movement into overdose. And that's, if you've heard that metaphor of, or that like parable, if you will, of, if there's two people who are sitting by the bank of a river and they see someone who's drowning and floating in the river, and they jump in and save them. And then they see two more and they jump in and save them. And then there's more and more and more people who are drowning in this river going by. And one person gets out and says, we need to go upstream. We need to figure out why people are falling in and stop them from falling in, because we can't save all of these people. That's what's happening here. And so stopping the front end, right, both the initiation and the progression, goes a very, very long way in terms of how we get that done and how we can stop it. But that doesn't change the fact that there's a lot of people here right now in progression, and maybe even in active addiction, and they matter too. And we've got to make sure that we're paying attention to them. The alternative path that people go to get here has to do with growth and development of using different substances over time, and eventually using opioids. And this is the other main way that people get their way towards opioid overdose. And that's because 90% of addictions, if you're going to have an addictive problem, 90% of people start before they get out of adolescence, before the age of 20, truly. And there's a lot that goes into this, right? Like this is, and we're going to talk more about this in literally just a second, but like the way that, say, THC products are advertised, as gummies, as lollipops, when we talk about vaping in particular as well, right? With flavors. And there's just an article again to the New York Times about 3-4 days ago talking about how vapes have gotten facelift. Essentially, I think they called it a Gen Z makeover to be more appealing to young people. And then, honestly, even advertising, right, about getting young people into addictive products. I took this picture out the window of my own car on the way to O'Hare. I'm located outside of Chicago. Real billboard. Took the picture myself. These are the sorts of messages that people are being more and more inundated with, whether or not we're talking about THC, whether or not we're talking about vaping. We can go on and on and on. But part of the reason why all of this matters is that the less risky people feel that using any drugs, whether or not we're talking about vaping, whether or not we're talking about THC. Although when we talk about how do kids get into using drugs, it's oftentimes where it starts, that in alcohol, is that the more risky you think it is to use something, the less likely you are to do it. So if we look at kids' chances of binge drinking here and then using marijuana here on the right, you can see that if they think there's a great risk of using it, that's that dark line, they are half as likely, or to switch that around, if they don't think it's very risky to binge drink, they're twice as likely to do it. And if they don't think it's that risky to use THC products, they are 15 times more likely to do it. Big difference there, right? So just to pick on THC for just a second, because we actually have a lot of recent data about this. There's a tremendous connection between THC use when you're younger and the development of opioids, an opioid use disorder. This was a longitudinal study that looked at the chances of developing a new addiction to prescription pills if you are using THC recreationally occasionally. It's that one, and frequent and very frequently when you're an adolescent. And you can see here that from no use, that odds ratio 0.5 to there, that's 5 times as high, and frequent and very frequent is 8 times as high. This study just came out, I think, last year, 2022. It was looking at the development of an opioid use disorder of either all opioids, prescription, or heroin if you are using marijuana products, THC products, when you're younger. And here is the rate. This was in a young adult urban cohort. So they were retrospectively asking these kids, or rather, this was longitudinal as well. They tracked them over time. This is for low and non-users of THC. This is if they started using THC as a young adult. So that's 18 to 25. This is if they started using it in a limited way when they were an adolescent. And this one with the really high bars is if they were using it frequently as a kid. And so you can see here that heroin goes from 2 to about 14. Any opioid misuse goes from 8 to 45. Really, really big jumps. And then this came out just earlier this year. I think it was published, it was accepted in January, but I think it was published in like May. They were looking at what's the chances, based on the type of cannabis products that you use as a kid, that you're going to subsequently use other harder drugs. And what they found was that if you're dabbing using the concentrates, it's almost 6 times as great of a chance. Edibles is about 3.5 times. Vape cartridges is about 3 times. If you're smoking it, it's 2.57. If you're only using one product, because a lot of people use multiple, hence why all these numbers are higher. But if you're only using one product, about twice as high that you're going to use other drugs later in life. And if you're using more than one THC product, it's getting close to 4 times. And so it's one of these things where, you know, and if you want me to answer it, I feel free to ask it as a question if you want me to dive into more about how this happens and how like the psychological and social and even chemical in some cases processes work that bring young people from these substances that they view as less risky towards using these ones that are more risky over time. But that's essentially what happens. And so this is that other pipeline. You've got a young person who's vaping or who's using THC, who's starting to build an identity around using drug use for fun and hanging out with people who do it, who are like okay with breaking the law for fun, you know, all these sorts of permission structures that come up in their mind. Again, we've got an opportunity where we can either stop that movement from progression and then stop it from getting to overdose. Because again, yes, there's less fentanyl that's being mixed into, say, you know, THC and vaping products, even black market ones. But what we're seeing from all the data is that it's setting young people up to be in a situation where there's some cocaine on the table or prescription pills or whatever else. And that's how these things develop. Because like nobody starts with meth. You know, like there's no kid who's like, you know what, I think I want to try drugs. Where's the meth, you know, or let's go find someone who can give me a syringe and some heroin, you know, like that's not how kids start when they're using. So really thinking about this though as a pipeline. And when we ask ourselves, so if we're not prescribing as much anymore, well, why are we still seeing this 1.7% increase nationally? And, you know, 20 or 30% increase year over year in Oregon and Washington. Well, it's because there's a lot of people in this pipeline, you know, and we have to have different strategies to help people at different points along the way.